Vietnam struggle. My topic was French colonialism in Vietnam and Vietnam's fight for independence after. So here's some early French influence, which were the first colonizers of the area that became Vietnam. Um, the French first made contact with the Vietnamese in the early 18th century, very early on, through the use of missionaries, traders, and diplomats. And early alliances are formed with the Vietnamese through military support of the Nguyen dynasty, which had just taken power in the area in the last 10 years. So the French colonization came rather quickly after they first set foot in the area. It began in 1858 with the Sphere of Influence movement that lots of different European countries were going through. There was a lot of colonization in this part of the world, along with Africa, and that was known as the Sphere of Influence. Just some quick facts. In 1867, Cochin, China became the first French colony in Vietnam, which is Cochin is the very, very southern tip of Vietnam. And then Annenheim and Tonkin were taken in 1883, allowing the full control of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These countries are what eventually would become known as French Indochina, and you can see that right here. This land right here is French Indochina, and then this is the coin that they had when they first colonized. Okay, so revolts soon perhaps started happening pretty soon after Vietnam was colonized by the local people. The Vietnamese began to resent French rule as social hierarchies favoring the French people developed, and they began extracting valuables from French Indochina. This hierarchy basically made it so the French people were in positions of power and great wealth in the country, while the local people that had been there for centuries were put into poverty and were being starved from their resources. In 1883, all that came together into a rebellion. But this rebellion was swiftly put down by 1887, allowing for 62 years of complete French dominance in the region. So, in the next couple slides, you're going to hear a lot about this man. His name is Ho Chi Minh, and he was the leading political leader for the Communist Vietnamese regime. Eventually becoming the president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was northern Vietnam. He was a big part of Vietnam's kind of independence movement, even since World War I. So he went at it for a long time until his eventual death in 1969. Okay. So, the effects of World War II. In March of 1945, the Japanese invaded French Indochina, or the area of French Indochina, and basically either ousted, arrested, or killed all the French officials in the area, effectively ending the administration and freeing the Vietnamese from French rule for the first time in 62 years. This campaign really brought to light to the Vietnamese people that Western culture could be taken down and wasn't just a permanent thing they had to deal with, because up until this point, no one had actually truly proven that you could beat Western culture, as they had just colonized everything in their path. But because of the Japanese, it changed the minds of Vietnamese people all around. Okay. So, post World War II, Ho Chi Minh led a group of, this is at the ends of the war. Ho Chi Minh actually led a group of Viet Cong nationalists, calling themselves Viet Minh, to work along U.S. forces to go on raids against the Japanese military. This is where Ho Chi Minh actually trained his men in guerrilla warfare tactics that they would use against the U.S. in the coming years. In August 1945, the Japanese were defeated by the Americans, ended Japan's grasp on the region for good. Japan would never return. So, as the war was over, the French were freed from Nazi control, and as soon as that happened, they attempted to reestablish dominance in Vietnam by backing the Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai, effectively controlling the northern region of the country. And so when that happened, and they tried to back that Vietnamese emperor to try to control the northern area, there was a communist uprising led by Viet Minh that actually forced Bao Dai to flee for his life. So after that, they had complete control of the north for the most part. So, and that's what this is about, for the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam. So, with the defeat of the Japanese and Bao Dai, Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist Viet Minh Party, the Communist Party, they captured the northern city of Hanoi on August 19th, 1945, automatically assuming control of the surrounding northeastern cities. And soon after, on September 2nd, the new regime announced the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh as a president. Also, just a fun fact, when they declared this Declaration of Independence, they actually directly quoted the U.S. Declaration of Independence. They said that all men are created equal, and did a large amount of quoting from our declaration. Although the Bao Dai was removed, the French still wanted to control the Vietnam. So they sent in General Jacques Leclerc in October of 1945 to Saigon in the south. This ultimately established a very heavy French control in the southern region of Vietnam. The French also sent military personnel to occupy the northwest city of Dien Bien Phu, that alongside Chinese colonizers that were already there. So the French controlled the south and the northwest, while Viet Minh controlled the northeast in Hanoi. Okay, so once some time, a couple years went by, and the Viet Minh Party grew with the resentment of Chinese and French colonizers began to grow as well in northern regions of Vietnam. So Vietnam locals began to really resent those that had been taking their land. In 1946, Ho Chi Minh began to talk to France about a possible peace treaty recognizing Vietnamese independence in the north. But soon after, the French fired on this Viet Minh controlled Haiphong, which was another northeastern city. So war ensued. But as for the possible peace treaty, they were going to try to oust the Chinese colonizers that were in the area, as they had no military aid, and just both parties wanted them out, both the French and Vietnamese. Okay, so the struggle for control of the Northwest went on for 9 years between the French and the northern Vietnamese, before Ho Chi Minh and his men were able to remove the last of the French in the battle for Dien Bien Phu in May 17, 1954. This battle lasted 55 days with the deaths of 3,000 French soldiers and 8,000 Vietnamese soldiers. With the final defeat of the French, they pulled out of Vietnam for good, leaving kind of a void of government and control in the South, which, as we can see on our next slide, was taken over by the USA. So when that happened, the USA came in as the Red Scare was in full swing. So the US swooped in to occupy the southern Vietnamese territories that were just left on by the French as a fear of communist control. They feared communist control by the Vietnamese Party. This practice of swooping in was known as containment and was a thing the U.S. did during the 60s to try to control communism. So, in 1954, the 1954 Geneva Accords happened to try to make sure that another big war wouldn't break out in the region. These accords said to split Vietnam into a communist Vietnamese-controlled north side and the U.S.-supported southern government along the 17th parallel. So you can see that, what that looks like right there. The accords were also called for a national election between the southern and northern territories in 1956 to decide the future of the country, whether it was going to be communist or free. So, and that's the Geneva Accords. Okay. So, this is kind of leading up to the war between the Vietnam War. After the accords were declared, the U.S. would put in Ngo Dinh Diem, who declared himself president of southern Vietnam, which they renamed to the Republic of Vietnam. With the U.S. government also completely refused the accords, and Diem canceled the 1956 elections and began to oppress all communist ideas and supporters residing in the South. The reason they refused the accords is because the U.S. and Diem did not really get a huge say in what actually happened in the accords, while the North did, so they felt that they were unfair. And a little fact is Ho Chi Minh actually wanted the elections to occur, because if they did, he likely would have won, since he was the most popular, at the time, he was the most popular guy going into the election. So he actually didn't want to fight the war, so because of this, war breaks out. As Diem begins to crack down on communist sympathizers in the Republic of Vietnam, an uprising consisting of communist people living in the South happens, mainly in the countryside, as the cities were heavily controlled by the Republic of Vietnam, while the country remained kind of communist. So in response to the uprising, the North began to send supplies in 1959 to their southern comrades they began to send supplies, and then in 1959 they actually sent men to the comrades, so full-out war commenced in the area. So, this movement of full-out war sparked a proxy war between the U.S., China, and Russia. So as the North began to raid the South, the U.S. began to drastically increase supplies and men in 1961 to retaliate versus the attacks. In response to this bolstering of supplies and troops, China and Russia began to back the North and their Viet Cong, effectively igniting a proxy war. That would go on to become the Cold War and well beyond when Vietnam was over. They did this multiple times. So, just some like major movements that occurred in the war was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So on August 2nd, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred with North Vietnamese patrol boats firing at the U.S. destroyer Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is the sea right off the coast of the Indochina region. And a second disputed attack is reported 2 days after that. So, in response to this, the U.S. passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, giving President LBJ the authority to increase military operations and provide airstrikes against the Viet Cong for the first time. Because although we say it's the Vietnam War, it's actually known as the Vietnam conflict in technical terms because a formal declaration of war never happened. So, another major kind of battle of the Vietnam War and the date is called the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive was the single biggest military strike during the Vietnam War, occurring on January 31st, 1968. So little significance behind this date is Tet is actually like Christmas for the Vietnamese people. And so the U.S. wasn't actually anticipating an attack on this day just because they thought that the Vietnamese people would be celebrating, but they did. So as for the attack, it consisted of a simultaneous attack on more than 100 southern Vietnamese cities, towns, and army installations. This attack actually ended up attacking 5 of the 6 major cities in Vietnam, and saw the movement of 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers. Some effects of this attack is that it turned the tide on American support for the war. A lot of people actually turned against support of the war after this attack because they just didn't want to see American soldiers kind of die anymore. And a lot of people actually saw it as like fighting a rich man's war. You can actually see a protester right here. Here is some aftermath of that attack. And then another fact is, although the kind of morale and support of the war in America had gone down, the Viet Cong had lost most of their soldiers in this battle and took pretty heavy losses that almost ended up making them lose the war. So, later on in the war, they had the Easter Offensive. So this occurred on March 27th, 1972, as the Viet Cong army attacked strategic positions that were on the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ. They also attacked North Saigon and Con Tum, which is the central highlands of Vietnam. It almost caused the fall of Saigon, and many people in America began to feel that the war was a lost cause. In response to this, and trying to raise morale, President Nixon retaliated with the most concentrated bombing campaign of the war on Vietnam from December 18th through the 30th. This directly caused the Viet Cong to begin the peace talks in Paris. So, before we move on, I just want to mention some smaller dates besides those major 3. So, in 1963, Dinh Diem, the guy that was backed in the South, he was the president of the Republic of Vietnam in the South. He was actually assassinated in November of 1963, the same month that Kennedy was. So that happened. In June of 1964, General William C. Westmoreland, he was put in charge of all ground kind of movement for the Vietnam War, and the U.S. began to directly see increases in kind of like in wins. Basically, they started winning more and weren't losing quite as bad. This is largely due to Westmoreland's tactics of search and destroy, which took place in the jungle. As before that, they were just kind of being sent in blind, with no true objective. Okay. So let me see. So the Paris Peace Accords, after many years of fighting, 19 years to be exact, U.S. activity in the war, after 19 years of U.S. activity in the war, the Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, withdrawing the U.S. from the war. So at the end of the war, here are just some quick numbers so you can kind of wrap your head around it. So over the war, over 500,000 U.S. troops were deployed, and then of those troops, 58,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives. So keep going. So this is the fall of Saigon. After the U.S. pulled out of the war in 1973, the war actually lasted another rough 1.5, 2 years. So the once the U.S. pulled out, the Viet Cong launched a large-scale offensive to end the war as quickly as possible. On April 30th, 1975, the North Vietnamese army reached the presidential palace of Saigon and gained control over the rest of southern Vietnam. They actually drove a tank through the palace gates to take over, and that's this very tank right here. You can see a picture of that happening. There was a lot of kind of resistance to the Communist Party once the war was over, and that's what we're going to talk about, them picking up the pieces of their country after the war. So the unification between to unite both sides, it was known as reunification between communist and free. So the reunification period was officially proclaimed in July of 1976, and the regime began a rapid transition to socialism in 1977 that resulted in the flight of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people. Saigon soon after was renamed to Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, who kind of kicked off this independence movement way back in World War I. He started talking about it. So as for the kind of toll of the war, 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died in the war, with over half their countryside destroyed just by napalm and Agent Orange and different things used by the Americans. Yep. Okay. And I got all my information from these websites. Here's 1 works cited page, 2 works cited page, 3 works cited page. Thank you.